Welcome to West Film, where every movie has a story worth telling. From heart-pounding action to twisty mysteries and dramas that stick with you, we dig into the plot, the characters, and the moments that make each film worth your time. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's jump into today's movie. This is West Film. Your story starts here. Jason's dog Carrie greets him at the door, tail wagging, the moment he steps inside. He heads upstairs to find his wife, Dani Daniels, and their two kids, Gary and Ruth. He's brought donuts for everyone, and the surprise instantly brightens the mood. Other kids especially can't contain their excitement. The good vibes don't last. Before long, the family notices their internet and network connection have gone dead. Dani seizes the moment to revisit a subject she's clearly raised before. She wants to move out of the house. As far as she's concerned, the place is falling apart around them. Her biggest worry is the chimney. It looks shaky enough that it could collapse at any time. And she tells Jason they can't keep living somewhere that causes them nothing but headaches. Before the discussion can go any further, Gary and Ruth chime in to remind their parents they still need to buy a Christmas tree. So the family starts getting ready to head out. When Jason gets to the front door, though, it won't budge. He figures the lock or the frame is just stuck, but repeated attempts go nowhere. He checks another door, nothing, then another, still nothing. He moves to the windows, hoping for another way out, but they're sealed just as tightly. Now genuinely alarmed, he grabs something heavy and starts hammering on the front door, hoping sheer force will do the trick. The door doesn't even show damage. He tries a window next day, same result. The glass won't crack. That's when it becomes clear this isn't an ordinary mechanical malfunction. Something has physically sealed the entire house shut. Things get stranger when they look outside. Every other house on the street has the same problem. Neighbors are trapped behind doors and windows that won't open, as though the whole neighborhood has been locked from the outside by some invisible force. There's one exception. Their neighbor Rava Adams was already outdoors when it happened. Realizing everyone else is stuck, she takes off to find help, and the trapped families watch her go with a flicker of hope. At least someone made it out. Maybe she can reach the authorities or bring back help. Still, nobody can wrap their head around what's actually happening. None of it feels remotely possible. With no way to force their way out, Jason and his family eventually give up trying and start talking through what comes next. The conversation drifts toward their neighbors, including a man down the street who owns a boat. Half joking, they say that once this whole ordeal is over, they should all take it out for one massive celebration. Across the street, the Richardson family has started adjusting too, communicating through their windows with handwritten signs. Since there's no way to reach each other in person, theories start circulating almost immediately. Maybe it's the government, maybe some kind of experiment, maybe someone suggests aliens. Jason doesn't have any better answers, and something else starts gnawing at him. What if this isn't just happening to their neighborhood? What if it's happening everywhere, and people all over the world have suddenly found themselves locked inside their own homes? That night, Jason pulls his family together and tries to steady everyone's nerves, promising they'll get through whatever this is as a family. Ruth is convinced the storm caused it all. The imprisonment started right round when the heavy rain began, so to her the link seems obvious. Jason isn't so sure. He tells her it might just have been a normal storm and that they shouldn't jump to conclusions about the weather being responsible. Dani, meanwhile, is consumed with worry about her parents. She has no way to reach them and no idea if they're okay. Jason tries to comfort her by pointing to the Richardsons across the street, who seem fine, reasoning that her parents are probably just as safe inside their own home. Then he tells her something she didn't know. He secretly bought a handgun, explaining that he got it for protection in case the family ever faced a real emergency. And given what's unfolding now, he clearly believes that moment has arrived. The next morning, Jason is still determined to find a way out. He goes back to the front door and tries again, but this time he notices something he missed the day before. Rainwater has pooled around the outside of the house, and everywhere it's touched the structure, the surface seems completely sealed. He starts connecting the dots and explains his theory to Danny. Maybe the storm really is behind all of this. Somehow the rain seems to have thrown up an invisible barrier around the entire house. Anything it touches becomes impossible to open, break, or pass through. They don't understand how something like that could exist, but for now it's the only explanation that fits what they're seeing. Later, the family sits down together for a meal. With the initial shock wearing off, they're forced to face a far more practical problem: survival. There's no telling how long this will last, and sitting around waiting for rescue without any kind of plan is a risk in itself. Jason tries to keep spirits up by digging out the family's music and movie collection, only to discover they own exactly 2 movies. Entertainment sorted, barely. They turn to counting supplies. Food is the biggest concern. After going through the kitchen and the rest of the house, they figure they have roughly 2 months' worth if they ration carefully. That buys them some time, but not much, and they immediately start being careful with water and electricity too, since there's no telling whether either utility will keep working, and no guarantee anyone could fix it if it stopped. Sometime later, Jason decides it's time to teach the kids skills that might actually matter if things don't get resolved soon. He shows Ruth and Gary how to clean and prepare a fish, and for them it feels more like a fun activity than a survival lesson. A week goes by. One evening while setting the table, Danny mentions she's found seeds in the house and wants to try growing vegetables indoors. Even a small, self-sufficient food source could end up being crucial. That night, Jason talks to Richardson through the window and learns the man is a dentist, a detail that quickly becomes irrelevant next to the news that his family has already run out of food. Jason can see how dire things are getting across the street, and it hits him hard knowing there's absolutely nothing he can do. Even though the houses are close, the invisible barrier makes reaching his neighbor impossible. Another 2 weeks pass. The family keeps trying to build some semblance of normal life. Jason dances around with the kids, they invent games, they find small ways to occupy their minds. Then Christmas arrives, and despite everything, the trapped families refuse to let it slip by unmarked. That night, the neighborhood celebrates from behind glass, unable to visit or share a meal but still acknowledging each other through their windows are the closest thing to a shared holiday they can manage. Later, Ruth spots movement outside and is startled by what she sees: a strange creature that looks nothing like any normal animal. She's convinced it's some kind of monster. Gary looks too but isn't sure what she's talking about. Around this time, the family's patience is also wearing thin over food. They're sick of eating the same meals over and over. At dinner, Ruth brings up the creature again, and oddly, she doesn't think it looked dangerous. She thought it seemed almost friendly. Jason brushes the idea off, telling her she was probably tired or scared and imagining things after being cooped up so long. Ruth doesn't take that well and gets visibly upset. Danny diffuses the tension with a batch of homemade cookies, giving everyone a brief taste of normal life again. Once the kids are asleep, Jason and Danny get some rare time to themselves, settling in to watch Air Force One, one of their only 2 movies, which Danny has now seen so many times she can hardly enjoy it. Something outside catches their eye: animals wandering freely through the neighborhood, reclaiming the streets now that there's no one around to scare them off. The next day, the family exchanges Christmas gifts. Nothing new, just old items from around the house wrapped up for one another, but nobody seems to mind. After everything they've endured, the simple act of opening presents gives them something to genuinely enjoy. There's more good news too. Danny's tomato plants have finally started growing, a small sign that gives everyone a bit more hope for the long haul. The hope doesn't last. Ruth soon notices Mrs. Richardson looking seriously ill across the street. Her condition worsens quickly, and she dies. It devastates the family. Jason had already suspected she might not survive after learning the Richardsons had run out of food, but watching someone die within sight, with no way to help, makes the danger feel suddenly very real. They're no longer just trapped. People can actually die here, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. It forces Jason to confront a fear he's been avoiding, that the same thing could eventually happen to someone in his own family. Around the same time, a new problem surfaces. The medication Jason's dog Carrie relies on is almost gone. Jason grows increasingly anxious, spending as much time as he can by Carrie's side. Though without more medicine there's only so much he can do. A few nights later, Ruth is up looking after Carrie when she spots someone outside. Ava, the neighbor who fled on day one, has somehow come back. Ruth alerts the family, and everyone rushes to the window. Ava looks terrified, desperately trying to get their attention and begging to be let in, but there's still no way to open anything. Then she starts screaming a warning. Something is going to kill all of them. Before she can explain, a massive shadow looms up behind her. A huge creature grabs her, and the family realizes, horrified, that it isn't alone. Several more of the things are moving through the neighborhood. All Jason and his family can do is watch through the glass. Then a blinding flash of light washes over everything, and when it fades, the street is empty again, and no Ava, no creatures, no trace that any of it happened. Badly shaken, Jason sets a new rule. Nobody spends unnecessary time near the windows. Whatever's out there is dangerous, and he doesn't want the family drawing attention to itself. Afterward, they go through notes Ruth has been keeping, observations and theories about everything they've seen. She reminds them this wasn't the first creature she'd spotted, and she still believes at least one of them wasn't hostile. Jason won't accept that. As far as he's concerned, nothing that looks and acts like those things can be trusted, and the safest move is to stay as far away as possible. He reassures the family that no matter what happens outside, he'll do everything he can to keep them safe. After witnessing Ava's disappearance, the family starts sleeping together in one room instead of separate bedrooms. Being close makes them feel safer. As time passes, Jason keeps tabs on the neighborhood, confirming Mrs. Richardson's death and noticing another nearby family falling apart through constant arguing. The isolation is clearly wearing on everyone differently, and Jason, not wanting Ruth and Gary to witness people deteriorating or dying around them, becomes even more strict about keeping the kids away from the windows. Then, unexpectedly, a cap drops down through the chimney while Ruth and Gary are exercising. Jason checks it out and realizes the chimney is no longer blocked. For the first time in ages, they might have a way out. Since Ruth is the smallest, she volunteers to climb through. Jason is nervous but recognizes it as their best shot, and he carefully lifts her into the opening. She works her way up, and at one point manages to get a hand outside. For a moment, escape seems within reach. But the opening is hemmed in by pipes and other obstructions, leaving no room for her to squeeze through no matter how she twists. Jason realizes pushing further would only endanger her, so they lower her back down. Their most promising shot at escape has failed. Before they can process the disappointment, they hear Carrie crying a different, more pained sound than usual. They rush over to find the dog's condition has badly worsened without his medication. He's growing weaker and suffering more. Jason realizes they've reached the moment he dreaded. No vet, no way out, no more medicine coming. They can't save him. After a painful family discussion, Jason decides to end Carrie's suffering himself, tearfully using the gun while the rest of the family stays close. The loss hits all of them hard. Carrie had become far more than a pet. After months of isolation, he was a core part of their small world. Danny wants to cremate Carrie's body through the chimney, feeling it's the respectful thing to do, but Jason sees it differently. With their food supply shrinking and no idea when they'll be free, and having just watched another family run out of food entirely, he says they can't afford to waste anything that might help them survive. As awful as the thought is, he wants to preserve the meat in case their supplies run out. Danny is repulsed by the idea of eating an animal that had been part of the family, but their circumstances leave her little choice, and eventually, however reluctantly, she accepts his decision. Months go by, and the family's remaining food dwindles to almost nothing. One day Jason spots wild animals near the house and tosses a small piece of meat to a stray dog that wanders close. Watching it eat gives him an idea. If food can draw animals toward the house, maybe he can apply the same logic from fishing and actually trap them, a potential lifeline if it works. Several more months pass before the rain returns. As the family scrambles to shut the windows against the coming storm, they spot one of the creatures standing right outside, with Ruth nearest the window. Everyone freezes, unsure whether any movement or sound might provoke it. For several agonizing seconds it just stands there before turning and walking away without approaching the house. Nobody moves until it's completely out of sight, and only then does Ruth rush back to her family and everyone finally exhale. 3 more months pass, and the food situation turns desperate. There's almost nothing left. Gary and Ruth are constantly hungry, their bodies visibly weakening, their energy fading, every meal smaller than the last. When Danny fully grasps how little food remains, the strain finally overwhelms her and she collapses. Jason rushes to her side, and it's clear the family isn't just struggling with hunger anymore. They're starting to break down physically and emotionally. Still, Jason refuses to let them give up hope, insisting they'll find a way through this somehow. Then Gary steps forward with something unexpected, the fish from their home aquarium, already cleaned and prepared. He suggests they eat them rather than let them go to waste. Watching his son take initiative like this, Jason realizes how much the kids have grown. Gary isn't just waiting for his parents to solve everything anymore, he's starting to take responsibility for the family's survival too. It's a small moment, but it gives Jason badly needed hope, and the family commits to facing whatever comes next together. Around the same time, Jason checks the bait he'd left outside and finds it gone. Proof his idea might actually work. He builds a homemade trap from whatever materials he can scrounge and sets it outside, checking it daily. Nothing, day after day. Then, finally, it catches something, a squirrel. It's barely any food, but after months of watching their supplies vanish, even one small animal feels like a huge win. Days later, they cook and share it, a rare moment worth celebrating, and proof they might have a renewable food source after all. Jason and Danny decide they need a longer-term solution too, and start growing more food indoors. Since regular pots aren't enough, they tear open part of the floor and turn the space beneath into a makeshift garden, planting whatever they can to try to build something like farmland inside their own home. Neither of them knows if it'll be enough, or how much longer they'll be trapped, but at this point survival means using every option available. Outside, conditions in the rest of the neighborhood have gotten far worse. Many of the people trapped alongside them have already starved to death. Others have clearly given up. Jason's family refuses to follow suit. As long as the 4 of them stay together, they keep pushing forward, settling into a grinding routine: hunt, grow what they can, preserve what remains, survive another day. Then, one day, the power goes out for good. Nobody's really surprised. They always knew it wouldn't last forever, and now that moment has arrived, making everything even harder. The story then jumps ahead 5 years. Gary and Ruth are adults now, having spent nearly their entire recent lives inside this one sealed house. The neighborhood outside looks almost unrecognizable. Most of the people who once lived there are gone, the streets empty and silent, nature steadily reclaiming what humans have abandoned. Jason is still doing exactly what he started years earlier, hunting animals near the property and bringing back whatever food he can find. His entire existence still built around keeping his family alive. During a haircut, Danny raises something that's been weighing on her. Gary has grown angrier and more frustrated as he's aged. Being trapped as a child was one thing, growing into an adult who's never experienced the outside world is something else entirely. Meanwhile, Jason keeps refining the systems he's built over the years, including automated traps that now pull captured animals directly into the house. A few days later, Danny notices something more alarming. The house itself is deteriorating, with cracks and structural shifts appearing more often. Jason isn't shocked. Years of nearly constant rain have soaked the ground around and beneath the house, and he believes the foundation could eventually give way, with the structure slowly sinking into the earth. Even if they can keep finding food, the house that's been protecting them might not hold up forever. Later, Jason gathers everyone in the garage to reveal a project he's been quietly working on. He's gotten their old car running again. Gary can't see the point. They can't open the garage, can't drive anywhere, so why bother fixing a car that will never leave the property? Jason asks him to help anyway. To him, the car represents something bigger than transportation. With so much already lost, food, electricity, the crumbling house, the dying neighborhood, he believes that if they stop maintaining the few things they still have, eventually they'll be left with nothing at all. Gary disagrees, and the conversation turns into an argument before he storms off. Afterward, Danny tells Jason privately that they can't keep focusing only on food, repairs, and survival. They need to pay attention to their kids too. Gary and Ruth are grown now, having spent years confined to a handful of rooms with only 3 other people, and Danny can feel them drifting apart even while living under the same roof. She worries that if the family keeps ignoring it, they'll end up surviving physically while losing each other emotionally. Jason listens and quietly agrees that something needs to change. Not long after, another storm rolls in. Following their well-worn routine, the family heads downstairs to secure house closing openings, reinforcing weak spots, sealing everything up before the storm intensifies. While they're busy, someone spots movement outside, one of the creatures. Then something unprecedented happens. At the front door, sealed for years, begins to slowly open. Jason immediately signals everyone to hide, and the family scatters through the house as the creature steps inside and starts moving room to room, unhurried, almost as though it knows they're hiding somewhere. Wherever it goes, an intense cold follows, and the freezing air starts killing the plants Danny has spent years cultivating. Leaves shriveling, the garden collapsing right in front of her. Devastated and furious, she quietly asks Jason for the gun. Jason hesitates as the creature keeps searching, drawing dangerously close to their hiding spots. Then, without warning, it reacts to a noise from outside, turns, and walks back out. The instant it's gone, Gary sees their chance. The door is open, and for the first time in years there's a clear path outside. He moves toward it, but Jason grabs him before he can run. Before anyone can argue further, the door slams shut on its own, sealing them in exactly as before. Then Ruth notices something on the floor, water the creature left behind. At first they assume it's just rain, but she realizes it's salty seawater. That discovery reframes everything. The family rushes back to the door hoping the barrier's been weakened, but it's as immovable as ever. Ruth starts theorizing about what the seawater might mean. Maybe these creatures are something like a leviathan, or a kraken, or some unknown relative of what people once called mermaids. She points out that humanity has explored only a fraction of the ocean, and despite water covering most of the planet, entire forms of life could exist down there that no one has ever encountered. She starts to wonder if these creatures have somehow taken over. If the planet belongs to them now. Jason refuses to accept that, insisting the house is still their home and the world outside still belongs to them too. Ruth listens quietly, then gives him a small nod. But things inside keep getting worse. Danny discovers the seawater tracked in by the creature has contaminated the garden soil with salt, killing almost everything she's spent years growing. Years of work gone in moments. Before they can even process it, one of Jason's automatic traps goes off, dragging a terrified squirrel inside. When Ruth approaches it, the animal lashes out and scratches her badly. She screams, and Jason and Danny rush over in a panic. Jason kills the squirrel before it can hurt anyone else. At first they hope the wound will simply heal, but by that night Ruth's condition is deteriorating. The scratches grow increasingly inflamed, and it's soon clear the wound is infected. This is a serious problem, After years of isolation, the family's medical supplies are almost completely gone. They have very little clean water left, and no antibiotics at all. Jason and Danny do what they can to clean the wound and keep Ruth comfortable, but her fever and weakness only worsen. By morning, Jason hits his breaking point. After years of staying calm, hunting, repairing, building, promising his family he'd protect them, he now has a seriously sick daughter and no medicine to help her. He snaps, runs to the garage, gets in the repaired car, and rams it into the garage door. It doesn't budge. He reverses and slams into it again and again, convinced enough force will eventually break it, but the door holds while the car takes the damage. During one collision he loses control and is badly hurt. Gary and Danny rush in, pull him from the wreck, and help him sit down as he struggles to catch his breath. For a moment, it seems his desperate attempt has accomplished nothing. Then it hits him. He'd told Danny the ground beneath the house had been shifting after years of relentless rain weakening the soil and foundation. If the doors and windows can't be opened, maybe they don't need them, maybe there's another way out underneath the house. Injured as he is, Jason starts tearing up the floor, with Gary helping clear debris, until they break through into an empty space below, a narrow passage connected to the sewer system, offering a possible route to another building without going outside. Jason tries to fit through but can't, the passage is too tight. Danny realizes she might be able to make it and volunteers to crawl through. Jason immediately thinks of the Richardson house. Richardson had once mentioned he was a dentist, meaning there's a good chance he kept medical supplies at home, possibly including antibiotics that could save Ruth. Danny lowers herself into the cramped, filthy tunnel and starts crawling, with no room to stand, pulling herself forward through the dark. Back home, Jason and Gary wait anxiously until they realize she's reached the Richardson property, and for the first time since Ruth got sick, Jason feels a flicker of hope. Inside, Danny finds a horrifying scene: Mrs. Richardson's decomposed remains, and the house itself ravaged by flooding. Nothing left of the home it once was. She forces herself to keep searching. Ruth needs the medicine. As the rain starts up again outside, she digs through cabinets and drawers until she finally finds antibiotics. Almost immediately, she realizes she's no longer alone. Several creatures have entered the house. She freezes, knowing she can't fight them and can't risk making noise, and hides while waiting for a chance to move. She slips past them as their attention wanders, making her way deeper into the house until she reaches the basement, where she's confronted with an even worse sight: Mr. Richardson's body, also dead. The shock makes her scream, and realizing there's no point hiding any longer, she bolts. Racing back toward the tunnel, she squeezes in and crawls as fast as she can. But one of the creatures spots her and gives chase. Unable to outrun it in such a tight space, she pulls out the pistol and fires. Back home, Jason hears the shots and rushes to the opening. Just as Danny reaches it, he grabs her and pulls her up, with Gary helping haul her the rest of the way in. But the danger isn't over. The creature is climbing up after her. With no time to seal the passage properly, Jason and Gary throw rocks and chunks of broken foundation down into the tunnel, piling on debris until it's completely blocked, trapping the creature on the other side, at least for now. Danny wastes no time getting the antibiotics to Ruth. All they can do now is wait. Gradually the medicine takes hold. Ruth's fever drops, her strength returns, and it becomes clear she's going to recover. The relief for Jason and Danny is enormous. After coming so close to losing another family member, they finally have real reason to feel hopeful again. Once the immediate crisis passes and Ruth starts healing, Jason tells Danny something they can no longer avoid facing: the creatures now know the family is alive. For years, part of their survival depended on staying hidden and unnoticed. That advantage is gone. Jason tells her the monsters will come back eventually, and this time he doesn't want to sit and wait. If they're coming to kill the family needs to strike first. Danny understands, and soon Gary and Ruth are brought into the conversation too. Everyone agrees hiding indefinitely is no longer an option. Gary points out that if the creatures can get into the house, there must be a way to use that against them instead of waiting for another attack. Maybe they can lure monsters in, trap them, and use the chaos to force the doors open. That becomes the plan. The family reworks sections of the house, builds makeshift barriers, sets traps in strategic spots, and converts anything they can into weapons. The goal: draw the creatures inside, force them into traps, and exploit the resulting chaos to break free. For the first time, they're not just trying to survive, they're preparing to fight. Meanwhile, Ruth keeps taking the antibiotics Danny risked her life to retrieve, growing stronger by the day until she's finally back on her feet, which only fuels the family's resolve. Then the day arrives. Jason decides they're ready, and the family takes their positions near the windows, waiting for the first sign of the creatures approaching. They don't wait long. Water starts pouring into the house from multiple directions, flooding the lower floors rapidly, just as it had at the Richardson house years earlier. But this time the family is prepared and nobody panics. They move into action. Danny spots a creature moving through the house and throws a homemade explosive at it, setting it aflame. Instead of retreating, it charges. Jason throws a spear and misses, then grabs another, closes the distance, and drives it into the creature, wounding it badly, though it still won't stop. The family retreats upstairs, luring it toward the storage area where the next phase of the plan is waiting. Once the injured creature follows them into position, all four attack together, driving more spears into it while ropes already tied to the car hold it fast. The more it struggles, the tighter the ropes become, and its own strength works against it until it loses its footing and its weight drags it down toward the flooded lower level, the ropes cinching further until it's completely immobilized. For the first time, Jason has one of these creatures entirely at his mercy. He steps toward it, demanding it open the door, but Ruth stops him before he can finish, warning that killing it could cost them their only chance at escape. Jason pauses and looks more closely. Something's different. The creature isn't attacking, isn't behaving like a predator. It's afraid, and he can see the fear plainly. Ruth's long-held belief that at least one of these creatures wasn't dangerous, might even be peaceful, suddenly comes back to him. He'd refused to believe her before, but standing over this frightened, restrained animal, he starts to understand what she meant. Maybe they aren't all the same. Maybe this one never wanted to hurt them. Jason lowers his weapon, pulls out a knife, and starts cutting the ropes free instead of finishing the creature off. As the last rope falls away, he tosses the knife aside to make his intentions clear. For several tense seconds, nobody moves. The creature slowly rises, looks at each of them in turn, and instead of attacking, walks to the front entrance and with barely any effort opens the door. The barrier that held the family prisoner for years is finally broken. Stunned, the family steps outside for the first time in years. But the freedom is short-lived. Several enormous creatures appear and surround them, and before Jason can react, all four are captured. It seems as though escaping the house has only led them into greater danger. Then the creature Jason spared appears in the doorway and confronts the others. Without any aggression, it seems to communicate with them, and the surrounding creatures respond immediately, releasing the family before quietly dispersing. Jason realizes what's happened. By showing mercy, his family has earned mercy in return. With the danger gone, they look back at the house that kept them alive so long. It's nearly swallowed by the earth, the unstable ground finally giving way beneath it. And something else has changed too. The rain has finally stopped. Looking around at what's left of their town, the family sees almost total devastation. Abandoned homes, empty streets, no sign of the people who once lived there. With nothing left to stay for, they gather whatever usable supplies they can find in the abandoned houses, food, tools, equipment, and eventually find a boat. After loading it up, they leave the ruined town behind and set out toward an unknown future, uncertain of their destination or what remains of civilization, but free for the first time in years to go looking for a new place to call home. As they sail, Ruth reflects on how their survival ultimately hinged on one choice: sparing the creature's life. Had Jason killed it, the others almost certainly would have killed the whole family in retaliation. She also starts to wonder if the creatures were never simply hunting humans. Maybe they weren't trying to destroy anyone at all, but were doing exactly what her family had spent years doing: fighting to survive, protecting their own, searching for somewhere to belong. In that light, the creatures don't seem so different from them after all. As the boat moves across the water, the radio crackles to life with a voice cutting through the static, a proof that other survivors are out there and trying to make contact. After years of isolation, the family finally has confirmation they aren't alone, and on that note of hope, the story ends. The core concept behind The Last House is probably its strongest asset. A family wakes up expecting an ordinary day, tries to head out, and discovers they simply can't. The front door won't open. Neither will the back door. The windows are sealed. And it doesn't take long to realize this isn't isolated to their house. The whole neighborhood seems to be trapped the same way. It's a fantastic hook. Simple enough to grasp instantly, strange enough that your imagination immediately starts filling in the gaps. What happened out there? Who's responsible? Why houses specifically? Why won't the rain let up? And, crucially, is there any way out at all? For the film's opening stretch, that mystery genuinely works, largely because the movie doesn't rush to explain itself. You're kept roughly at the same level of understanding as the family, and that alone makes the house feel different almost immediately. It's still their home, same furniture, same rooms, same walls, but once escape becomes impossible, everything starts to feel cramped and claustrophobic. That's an effectively unsettling touch. You can see freedom right through the glass, you just can't reach it. Honestly, the film could have lingered on that idea much longer and I wouldn't have minded. Once it becomes clear no rescue is imminent, the story shifts from an escape narrative to a survival one. Food dwindles, resources take on new importance, and ordinary household items suddenly matter in ways they never did before. This is where Jason really comes into his own. Some viewers pushed back on how quickly he turns into someone who can fix or build almost anything. But that criticism never bothered me much. The film establishes early on that he's an engineer, so it tracks that he'd be the one staring at spare parts and equipment thinking about how to repurpose them. Those survival sequences are genuinely engaging. Watching him improvise and maneuver his way through obstacle after obstacle gives the film real personality. And it's a lot more compelling than simply waiting around for the next bad thing to happen. The trouble is that the longer this situation drags on, the more the movie asks you to stop asking questions, and that's where things start to unravel. This family apparently survives inside the house for years, not weeks or months. Once the story commits to that time frame, the logistical questions become unavoidable. Where's all the food coming from? How is everything being maintained? Where does the soil for their indoor garden come from? What about waste disposal, medicine, broken equipment? How are the utilities still running after so long? Because if power and water are still functioning years later, someone has to be maintaining that infrastructure somewhere. And if society outside is functional enough to keep those systems going, why hasn't anyone figured out what's happening to all these trapped families? But if civilization has collapsed entirely, why do those systems keep working? The film never really settles that tension. Smaller inconsistencies pile up too. The relentless rain doesn't always track logically with its supposed environmental effects. Doors and windows apparently seal themselves and somehow heal from damage. Yet the chimney turns out to be a viable escape route, which raises the obvious question of why that opening behaves differently. Zoom out beyond the single house, and the whole premise gets shakier still. Did literally nobody on Earth have a window cracked open when this started? What about people in apartment buildings, high-rises, places with different ventilation entirely. A movie certainly doesn't need to answer every hypothetical a viewer could dream up. Nobody needs a 40-minute lecture on architecture, but the central rule of the story needs to be sturdy enough that these basic questions don't immediately undercut it. At times, The Last House just isn't quite sturdy enough. There are also moments where the rules seem to bend depending on what the plot needs next. That's the risk with a mystery-driven premise like this. Not knowing anything at the start is thrilling, but once the film starts revealing more, you naturally expect clarity to follow. Instead, the opposite sometimes happens. As the creatures and the larger phenomenon come into view, the questions multiply rather than resolve. What exactly are these things? Why trap people in their homes specifically? How is this happening on such a massive scale? Why this particular method? And toward what end? If there's a deeper purpose behind it all, what are we meant to take away? This is where audience opinion really splits. Some will argue that's the whole point. You're not meant to know everything, and I understand that stance. There's real power in being stuck in a situation nobody can explain. Genuine fear doesn't always come with tidy answers. But there's a difference between deliberate mystery and simply missing information. If a film keeps building its entire structure around one enormous question, at some point I need to sense that the filmmakers know the answer, even if they choose not to spell it out. With this movie, I'm not always convinced they do. That's frustrating, because the underlying premise really is strong. You don't need 20 different creatures. You don't need a sprawling mythology dump. You don't need a scientific breakdown of every wall and window. The simple version already works. A family can't leave home. Their supplies are running out. Nobody knows why or how long it'll last, and the house that once sheltered them starts to feel more like a cage with every passing day. That's the version of this movie I found most compelling, and it works best whenever it sticks close to that idea. It starts to wobble whenever it tries to explain the wider world without the underlying logic to support it. Because an impossible premise is fine, that's what science fiction is for. But a premise that stops following its own rules is a much harder sell, and unfortunately that happens more often as the film goes on. The cast is a big part of what keeps this movie watchable even when the script falters. Greta Lee and Wagner both bring real credibility to the family, enough that you want to see them through even when certain choices don't quite land. Moura comes out ahead here. Jason is easily the most active character, always building, fixing, planning, improvising rather than just waiting for things to change, which goes a long way. I've seen people criticize how quickly he becomes a survival gadget genius, but given he's an engineer, he's exactly the person I'd expect to look at scrap materials and start problem solving. That part feels earned. What feels less earned is the family dynamic overall, which is a real issue given how much the film depends on you buying into these relationships. We're asked to accept that these people endure years of confinement together through hunger, fear, boredom, and illness are the kind of pressure that should make their bond the emotional backbone of the film. Sometimes it is. There are scenes where the parents genuinely feel like two people trying to keep their kids alive while quietly falling apart themselves. And when the film slows down enough to let that breathe, it's effective. Other times, though, the family chemistry feels oddly hollow. You know they're related because the script tells you so, not because you feel it. There are stretches where they read more like four characters sharing a house than people who've spent years loving one another, and that undercuts a lot of the emotional weight the film is trying to carry. If I don't fully believe these people love each other, every sacrifice and hard decision loses some of its punch. The kids are probably where the writing is weakest. Some viewers found their behavior realistic. Kids making poor choices under extreme stress, scared and confused in an abnormal situation and there's something to that. I can forgive a fair amount of impulsiveness given the circumstances. But there are also moments where they feel less like real children and more like convenient plot devices manufactured to create the next problem for the parents to solve. There's a meaningful difference between a believable mistake and a character doing something absurd purely because the story needs a complication. The chimney escape attempt is a good example. A desperation explains a lot, but sending a child into a completely unknown environment is such an extreme risk that instead of feeling tense, you start wondering why any parent would agree to it, and once you're questioning the logic like that, the suspense takes a hit. Greta Lee's performance is similarly divisive. Some viewers found her grounded and believable as a mother holding everything together. Others thought the character came across flat or hard to connect with. I suspect the issue is more about the material she's given than her ability as an actor. Moura's character has a clear, active function. He's always solving something, while Danny's role leans more heavily on emotional beats. So if the family drama isn't landing for you, there's less for her performance to hold on to. There's also some criticism floating around about Moura's accent shifting between scenes. Not everyone caught it, but for those who did, it became distracting, and that's sort of emblematic of the whole film. Individually, a lot of these issues are minor, but there are enough of them that once you start noticing, it's hard to stop. The bigger structural problem is character development. This family supposedly spends years in isolation, which is more than enough time for relationships, personalities, habits, and dynamics to fundamentally shift. The film does show some of that, but rarely with the depth that kind of time span deserves. Too often it leans on a montage to tell you people have changed rather than actually letting the audience feel that change happen. That's a missed opportunity, because the setup is practically built for character drama. Imagine being unable to walk away from someone for years. Every argument lingers, every resentment festers, with no work, school, friends, or privacy to offer any release. You're stuck with the same people within the same walls, day after day. That should generate incredible tension, and occasionally it does. There's an obvious pandemic parallel here too. The film clearly taps into that feeling of confinement and watching ordinary routines lose their meaning. What's happening in the story is far more extreme, of course, but the emotional shape is familiar: restlessness, irrational decisions, small disagreements ballooning because there's nowhere to retreat to, the house feeling smaller even though nothing about it has physically changed. That framing actually makes some of the family's behavior easier to accept. Most people probably wouldn't stay perfectly rational under this kind of pressure, and hunger, fear, and prolonged uncertainty would push even sensible people toward bad decisions. So not every irrational moment automatically reads as bad writing. Some of it feels genuinely human. The tricky part is knowing where believable human irrationality ends and screenwriting convenience begins. And the film doesn't always strike that balance well. Audience reaction to the family drama itself splits sharply. Some viewers consider it the emotional heart of the movie. They were fully invested in Jason, his wife, and the kids, and found the story surprisingly moving, with the creatures almost secondary to watching this family hold together. Others wanted the opposite: less domestic conflict, more aliens, more action, more outside danger. Both reactions make sense, honestly, because the film itself never fully commits to which one it wants to be. Is this a family drama with a sci-fi threat layered on top, or a sci-fi survival story that spends too much time on domestic conflict? Depending on your answer, the exact same scene can feel essential or like a waste of time. Then there's the material involving animals, which pushes the emotional tone into much more uncomfortable territory. The film is clearly interested in how humans treat other living creatures. Themes of compassion, survival, nature, and the idea that the planet doesn't belong exclusively to us. That's probably one of the clearest messages in the movie. We're not alone here, animals and nature matter, and how we treat other life says something about who we are. Given that framing, It makes sense why animal suffering plays a role in the story, but that doesn't mean every viewer will be comfortable with it, as some found those scenes upsetting enough to stop watching altogether, and that's worth flagging, since it's not a minor background detail. If you're sensitive to depictions of animal cruelty, this could be a genuinely hard watch. Oddly, the film seems to be using that discomfort in service of a message about compassion, and whether that trade-off works for you is very much a personal call. The underlying theme may live with empathy: value other people, don't treat nature as something that exists purely for our use, recognize that every living thing shares this world. Is a good one. Whether the film develops it naturally is a separate question. Sometimes it does, other times it feels like you're connecting the dots only after the credits roll. That, ultimately, is where I land on the film's characters and emotional core. The actors consistently outperform the material. Moura brings energy, Greta brings emotional grounding, and there are moments where this family feels genuinely vulnerable and worth rooting for. But the script doesn't always give them the depth to justify how much time we spend in their company, and for a film that essentially locks us in a house with one family for years, that matters. You don't just need to believe they can survive together, you need to believe they actually belong together. Visually, the film is considerably stronger than the writing sometimes deserves. Whatever criticisms apply elsewhere, the atmosphere isn't really one of them. The house feels convincing as a place where people could slowly lose their grip on reality. At the outset, it still reads as an ordinary family home, familiar rooms, familiar lighting, nothing unusual. As the situation deteriorates, though, the space evolves right along with the family. Plants creep further in, everything feels wetter and more enclosed, and because so much of the runtime is confined to this one location, that visual evolution really carries weight. Had the house looked static for 2 hours straight, the film would have worn thin fast. Instead, the production design keeps giving the place a shifting identity: a shelter one moment, greenhouse the next, prison after that, and eventually something that feels like it's merged with whatever's happening outside. It's one of the smarter choices the film makes. The cinematography holds up well too. Shots involving rain, water, and light look genuinely striking, especially given how bleak the underlying story is. Lighting does a lot of heavy lifting, distinguishing the early stretch when the family still assumes this is temporary from the later sections where the house feels like its own strange, sealed-off ecosystem they've had to accept. There are moments where the visuals suggest a richer, more thoughtful film than the screenplay actually delivers: a moody shot of rain streaking down glass, light cutting across a plant-choked room, and you're genuinely struck by how haunting it looks. Then dialogue kicks in and some of that power drains away. That's the recurring frustration with the filmmaking here. For every element that works, something else seems to be pulling against it. The narration is probably the clearest example of that friction. I never fully understood why the film needed it. It has this soft, reflective quality that frequently doesn't match what's happening on screen. Scenes dealing with something horrifying get narration that sounds like it belongs in a gentler family drama, which doesn't heighten the emotion so much as throw the tone slightly off. Stranger still, the narration occasionally seems to contradict what we're actually shown. At one point we're told certain neighbors are dead while the footage suggests otherwise. Maybe there's an intentional layer of unreliability there, or some timing nuance the film doesn't fully clarify, but as presented, it reads more like an oversight than a deliberate choice, which pulls you out of the story at exactly the wrong moment. The score has a similar problem. There are stretches where it works beautifully when the film leans into silence and ambient sound, letting the rain and the quiet inside the house do the emotional work. The tension is genuinely effective, and you find yourself listening for small noises because the film has trained you to expect trouble. That's strong suspense craft. But other times, a music cue feels completely disconnected from what's happening on screen. Something devastating unfolds while the score carries an almost warm, nostalgic mood that just feels mismatched rather than intentionally ironic. Horror films use upbeat music against dark imagery all the time, and that contrast can land well when it's clearly deliberate. Here, it more often feels like the music and the scene simply weren't speaking the same emotional language. There's also a family fun sequence set to music that I understand the intent behind. These people need moments of normalcy, routine, a chance to just be a family for 5 minutes, but it comes across a little forced, more performative than spontaneous. It might land for some viewers. For me it felt slightly staged. Then there's the dialogue, which is probably where the editing hurts the performances most. Many scenes race through conversation far too quickly. Someone delivers a major piece of information, gets an instant reaction, cut, next line, cut again, without anyone really sitting with what they've just heard. Real people don't process a crisis that fast. If someone tells you something genuinely shocking, you don't immediately respond with the perfectly composed next line. Sometimes you just stare. Sometimes you don't know what to say. Sometimes you ask them to repeat it because you're sure you misheard. Those small pauses are usually what sell a performance as believable, and the film often doesn't give its actors the room for that. In several moments, I didn't feel like the cast was underperforming. I felt like the editing was cutting away before they had the chance to actually perform. That's a meaningful distinction, and it suggests the film could probably lose some runtime without feeling more rushed, trimming repetitive arguments and exposition we already understand, then giving the important scenes a few extra seconds to breathe. The result is a strange overall rhythm. The film can feel too slow in its overall pacing, while individual conversations feel edited like short-form content, everything constantly rushing forward, leaving little room for reflection, which makes some emotional beats feel manufactured rather than lived in. The direction follows a similar pattern. Julio Luizia clearly has a handle on making the film look polished. Confident camera work, creative use of the central location, well-staged suspense sequences, and a more assured handle on scale once the story turns more physical in its later stretch. The effects work holds up reasonably well too. Some viewers even considered it one of the film's stronger elements. The creatures may not feel wildly original, but technically they're well integrated into the environment, and the film never suddenly looks cheap once the supernatural elements arrive. Impressive given it clearly isn't working with an unlimited budget. Much of the scale is implied rather than shown outright. You don't need to watch entire cities fall apart to understand something enormous is happening, because the family's isolated experience carries that weight on its own. That's smart filmmaking. The bigger issue is tone. The film shifts constantly between psychological drama, science fiction, creature thriller, family story, and environmental parable. Genre blending isn't inherently a problem. Plenty of great films pull it off, but here you can often feel the gears shifting rather than experiencing a smooth transition. One scene wants you to sit with the family's emotional pain, the next pivots to mystery, then survival mechanics take over, then the creatures become central, then it's back to family conflict, then the film reaches for something bigger about humanity and nature. It's a lot to juggle, and the editing doesn't always smooth the seams. At times the film feels assembled rather than genuinely flowing. All the pieces technically connect, but you can still see the joints. That's probably why the atmosphere feels far more consistent than the narrative structure. The atmosphere knows exactly what it's going for: the rain, the confinement, the shifting environment, the eerie silence, that persistent sense of being watched. That part works. The storytelling is much less sure of itself, over-explaining in places where ambiguity would serve it better, while withholding clarity where it's actually needed. It rushes through conversations while letting less essential scenes linger, gives its actors quiet moments to shine and then keeps cutting away from them, builds strong visual metaphors and then buries them under dialogue that exists mainly to explain plot points. That contradiction defines the filmmaking throughout. There were moments where I thought, This is genuinely well made, and minutes later I'd be questioning an editing choice. The film can look expensive while feeling clumsy in the same scene. It can build tension through lighting alone and then deflate it with narration. It can offer a beautiful image and immediately undercut it with dialogue that sounds like it exists purely to move the plot along. That tension sums up The Last House pretty well. The craft is visibly there: the cinematography, the location work, the lighting, much of the sound design, the production design, all of it holds up. But those elements are constantly straining against writing and editing choices, pulling the film in a different direction. And honestly, that push and pull is probably why I stayed engaged even as the story started losing me. Even when the film wasn't convincing me of its ideas, I still wanted to keep watching it. The pacing is another area where audience reactions split sharply, because the film somehow manages to feel both too slow overall and too rushed within individual scenes. Most of the complaints center on the first half, which is largely devoted to the family adjusting, arguing, figuring out what resources they have and what's changing around them. If slow burn survival storytelling appeals to you, there's plenty to enjoy. You get real time to sit with the mystery, that persistent uncertainty about how long this will last, the house growing more oppressive the longer they're stuck in it. That part works. But if you're waiting for the horror elements to really kick in, the first half can feel like a slog, especially given the film runs close to 2 hours and there are stretches that feel like the story is deliberately withholding the creatures because it hasn't decided when to introduce them. That gets at the central genre problem. What exactly is this movie trying to be? A horror film, a sci-fi survival story, a family drama, a psychological thriller, a creature feature? It moves between all of them, and depending on what you walked in expecting, that's either fascinating or maddening. If the marketing had you expecting a straightforward horror movie, the disappointment is understandable, because there really isn't much conventional horror here. It's not built around jump scares, and for a long stretch the fear comes purely from the idea of being trapped without explanation rather than any direct threat. Some viewers will embrace that, others will reasonably ask where the actual horror is. The film probably works best approached as a tense family survival story with horror elements woven in, rather than something built around constant, escalating threat the way a film like A Quiet Place is, and that comparison is instructive. In A Quiet Place, the rules generate tension almost immediately. Sound equals danger, so every small noise carries weight, and you're nervous just watching characters cross a room because the film has clearly taught you what's at stake. Here, the rules are much murkier, so even when danger is present, it's not always clear what you're supposed to be afraid of, which softens the tension considerably. The suspense here is less about holding your breath and more about sitting with uncertainty, which only carries a film so far before audiences want something more concrete. Once the creatures take a bigger role, the film shifts gears fairly dramatically. The first half is largely psychological, while the second half leans into a more conventional sci-fi creature thriller mode, and that transition isn't entirely smooth. In some ways, this is where the film loses some of what made its setup so compelling in the first place. A family trapped in an ordinary house for years is already an unsettling premise on its own. It doesn't necessarily need a mountain of mythology piled on top before the creatures are shown clearly. Your imagination is doing a lot of the work, wondering whether the force behind all this is alien, environmental, supernatural, or something else entirely. Once the film starts offering answers or partial answers, the threat inevitably becomes more familiar and, for some viewers, visually reminiscent of other franchises like Predator. That's not necessarily a knock on originality so much as an acknowledgement of a common risk. The unknown is almost always scarier, and the actual creature design has to work hard to replace everything your imagination had already conjured. I'm not entirely convinced this film clears that bar. At the same time, plenty of viewers wanted even more of the creatures, more encounters, more chases, more moments forcing the family into direct confrontation, and that's a fair ask too. since introducing a large-scale external threat naturally raises expectations about how central it should be to the story. Instead, the family drama continues to dominate a lot of the runtime, which creates a strange split. Some audiences feel the creatures crowd out the more grounded story, while others feel they barely register at all. That divide alone suggests the balance isn't fully working out. The film is trying to satisfy two very different audiences, those who want contained psychological drama, and those who want a full sci-fi monster movie, without ever quite letting one naturally grow out of the other. Instead, it feels like a lane change, extensive time spent on the family adapting to isolation, followed by a sudden shift towards something bigger, louder, and more physical, a shift that really crystallizes in the third act. Reactions to that final stretch vary widely too. Some viewers consider it the film's strongest section, a more immediate danger, higher stakes, a welcome jolt of urgency after such a long build-up. After investing that much time, getting real payoff can feel satisfying. The threat stops being theoretical, the effects work becomes more involved, and the family is pushed harder than ever. For some, that's exactly what the story needed. Others feel the third act is where the film falls apart, trading the strange, claustrophobic tension of the earlier sections for something far more conventional, ACG creature action, bigger set pieces, familiar survival thriller beats. Personally, I lean toward the latter view, not because it's poorly executed on a technical level, but because it becomes less distinctive. The strength of the premise was always its smallness: one family, one house, no way out. That's enough on its own. It doesn't need to balloon into a full-scale monster spectacle to feel meaningful, and arguably the more the film expands its scope, the less intimate and less interesting it becomes. That's also why the runtime becomes more noticeable by the end. Spending nearly 2 hours slowly building a mystery means the final stretch needs to make that patience feel worthwhile. Some viewers clearly felt it did, others felt like all that waiting led them to a much more generic conclusion than the setup promised, trading the elements that felt fresh for one's audiences have already seen plenty of times before. That's a tough trade-off. The pacing gets strange too, because the middle section can feel stretched thin while the ending rushes forward quickly, giving the film almost two different rhythms. The first half saying slow down, sit with this family, let the isolation sink in, and the final stretch saying everything is happening at once now. That shift can feel abrupt. There's also a real disconnect in how viewers describe the film's suspense, as some found it essentially suspense-free. Others say they were on the edge of their seat throughout. That sounds contradictory, but both reactions make sense depending on what kind of tension you're looking for. If you define suspense as waiting for a monster to strike, the film can feel fairly flat. If you define it as watching a family slowly run out of options, there's plenty to hold on to. The nature of the threat keeps shifting throughout the film. First it's the house itself, then hunger, then the family's own fraying dynamic, then finally the creatures. And while that evolving sense of danger is interesting conceptually, every shift risks losing viewers who were more invested in whatever came before. That's probably the core issue with the genre blending throughout. There's a version of this film that commits fully to psychological horror, keeping the creatures mysterious, focusing entirely on the house, the passage of time, and a family slowly adapting to something incomprehensible. That could have been deeply unsettling. There's another version that leans fully into sci-fi survival, introducing the creatures earlier, establishing clear rules, delivering more encounters, more strategy, more action. That could have been a lot of fun too. Instead, the film sits somewhere in between, which sometimes makes it feel refreshingly unpredictable and other times just indecisive. By the third act, you can really feel it trying to give every audience something, more action for viewers who'd been waiting, more emotional stakes for the family drama crowd, more creature mythology, more visual spectacle, more explanation, more danger, all crammed into the ending. It makes for a finale that's undeniably more intense and eventful. but not necessarily more compelling. The film gets bigger. I'm just not convinced it gets better. What the movie is actually trying to say is arguably more interesting than how it ultimately says it. There are clear thematic threads here about family, community, nature, compassion, and how humans treat other living creatures. As the film reaches for something larger than just family gets trapped, weird creatures show up. It seems to be pushing toward the idea that humans aren't separate from the natural world. We share it with animals, with nature, with each other, and perhaps the film wants us to consider how differently we'd behave if we suddenly found ourselves controlled, trapped, or treated as something less than the dominant species. That idea gains some traction through the family's evolving relationship with animals and how survival gradually reshapes what they're willing to do, as suggesting that compassion still matters even under desperate circumstances, that how you treat other living things ultimately reflects who you are. And maybe that kindness carries its own consequences. The problem is that this meaning doesn't always land clearly while you're actually watching. Much of it seems to click into place only afterward, once you sit back and start piecing it together yourself. Was this about humanity's relationship with nature? About some kind of punishment? About coexistence? Just about family? Some sort of moral test? That ambiguity isn't inherently a flaw. I appreciate films that leave room for interpretation rather than spelling out their themes explicitly. But there's a meaningful difference between leaving space for the audience to think and simply leaving them to assemble the film's meaning entirely on their own. The Last House comes uncomfortably close to that latter category, which brings us to the ending. This is where the film is going to lose a lot of viewers. Some found it genuinely hopeful and emotionally satisfying. After watching this family suffer for so long, the ending offers real release, a sense that all that pain might lead somewhere other than total ruin. If your primary investment is in the family itself, that may well be enough. You don't necessarily need every creature explained or a diagram of how the houses were sealed. You just want to know what it all meant for these people, and emotionally, the film does try to deliver that. But if you've spent the entire runtime waiting for the central mystery to resolve, the ending can feel deeply frustrating, because the big questions remain unanswered. Why were people trapped in the first place? Why houses specifically? And why for so long? What exactly are these creatures? And what do they actually want? Why does the situation resolve the way it does? And what changed? What were the actual rules governing any of this? The film never really provides clean answers. Some will call that intentional ambiguity, others will call it unfinished writing. And honestly, the film gives both camps plenty of ammunition. It's not a simple case of you either get it or you don't. It feels more like the movie is asking each viewer to decide for themselves how much explanation they personally need before thematic resonance starts to feel like a substitute for actual answers. For me, the emotional through line is there, but the logical payoff is considerably weaker. And that's a difficult combination for a film that spends so much time building mystery. Nearly 2 hours of why is this happening can't be fully resolved by maybe it's about compassion. A theme can support an answer, but it can't entirely replace one. There's also a real possibility the ending is deliberately leaving room for a sequel. Plenty remains unexplored here. The wider world, the full nature of the creatures, what happened to everyone else, how the phenomenon actually works, whether humanity took anything away from it. There's clearly sequel material sitting in reserve, and a follow-up could genuinely make this first film feel more purposeful in retrospect. But I'm never fully comfortable defending an ending by pointing to a hypothetical future installment. A sequel can certainly add context, but it shouldn't be required just to make the original film feel complete. That's part of why managing expectations matters so much with this movie, because viewers seem to walk in anticipating very different things. If the trailer, the presence of Greta and Wagner, and Louisia's name led you to expect a sharp, serious sci-fi thriller, the disappointment is understandable. The marketing sells a bigger concept, the cast implies stronger character work, and the mystery-driven setup implies a more satisfying payoff than the film ultimately delivers, and that gap between expectation and execution becomes part of the criticism itself. Some viewers came away feeling like they were promised something more ambitious than what actually showed up on screen. On the other hand, plenty of people went in completely cold, and no trailer, no reviews, no real sense of what the film was about, and those reactions tended to be noticeably more positive.